The scene opens in a cozy diner, a place where time seems to slow down. Red booths line the walls, and neon signs flicker, casting a soft glow across the room. The hum of the diner's kitchen and the clinking of coffee cups create a comforting background noise. In the midst of this, we see 72-year-old Mr. Johnson sitting at his usual booth, waiting for his meal. His attire is neat and well put together, his black suit, though a bit worn, showing years of dignity and pride. The cane resting against the side of the booth adds to his stature, a subtle yet undeniable symbol of the many years he's lived. His eyes, though tired, remain sharp and observant as he scans the menu, taking his time, content in the quiet of his moment. Mr. Johnson is calm and dignified, a figure who commands respect in his community. He's seen much over his years, triumphs, struggles, and countless lessons learned. His hands, weathered with age, rest on the table, and the lines on his face tell stories that words cannot fully express. He is a man who knows what it means to live, to endure, and to understand the complexities of life. He's no stranger to hardship, but there's a quiet strength in him that makes his presence felt even in the most subtle of ways. He doesn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. His history, his experience, and his bearing are enough to make him a respected figure in the diner, though not everyone here may recognize that just yet. As Mr. Johnson waits, the door to the diner opens with a slight jingle. The young waitress enters, her face etched with the weariness of a long day's work. Her uniform is a bit disheveled, and her steps are quick, almost impatient. She's clearly tired, and it's written all over her face. The clattering of plates and the sound of orders being shouted from the kitchen only seem to add to her frustration. As she approaches Mr. Johnson's booth, she doesn't take a moment to greet him, her eyes instead narrowing as she flips the menu in front of her. "Can I help you?" she asks, her tone sharp and lacking warmth. Her eyes don't meet his as she glances over him, quickly assessing, but it's clear that she doesn't really want to engage with him. The exasperation in her voice is palpable, a reflection of her own weariness, and perhaps a bit of indifference. She doesn't know much about Mr. Johnson, and frankly, it seems as though she doesn't care. He's just another customer to her, another face in the crowd, someone who'll demand her time and attention, just like all the others. Mr. Johnson doesn't respond right away. He studies her for a brief moment, taking in the haste with which she's approached him. There's something in his calm, steady gaze that seems to cut through her frustration. He's lived long enough to understand that sometimes people don't act out of malice, but out of the burdens they carry. He can sense her exhaustion, the weight of her day that has made her short with him. Still, his voice is soft but firm when he speaks. "Good evening, young lady," he says, his tone steady and composed. "I'm just waiting for my meal. You must be having a busy day, huh?" His words are simple, but they carry a quiet grace, a reminder of the respect he's earned over the years. The waitress hesitates for a brief moment, the edge in her voice softening, if only a little. She looks at him again, perhaps noticing the calm in his demeanor. Or perhaps it's just the weight of his years that makes her pause. But she quickly masks it, returning to her usual briskness. "Yeah, it's been one of those days," she mutters under her breath, her eyes not quite meeting his as she grabs the menu from the table. Her impatience is still there, but it seems, for a brief moment, that she's been humanized by Mr. Johnson's quiet dignity. However, the hardness in her attitude doesn't quite fade. As Mr. Johnson waits for his meal, he reflects on the young waitress, on the lives that cross his path in fleeting moments, on the interactions that sometimes tell more about a person than they realize. He knows that she doesn't know him, doesn't see the full picture of who he is. But for a brief moment, his patience, his quiet grace, has allowed him to make a connection. He knows that life has a way of teaching us lessons we don't expect, often through the most mundane moments. And for him, it's a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness or understanding can break through walls we never knew existed. The camera lingers on Mr. Johnson for a moment longer, capturing the depth in his eyes, before cutting back to the hurried pace of the waitress as she walks away. The contrast between the two characters, his calm, steady presence, and her rushed, impatient demeanor, sets the stage for what's to come. What happens next will challenge both of them in ways neither could have anticipated. The atmosphere in the diner is typical for an early evening. The soft clink of silverware, the hum of conversations, and the occasional sizzle of food from the kitchen create a comforting rhythm, one that has existed for years. The neon lights flicker, casting a warm glow that contrasts with the harshness of the night outside. Regulars occupy their usual spots, some lost in their own thoughts, others chatting idly. For many, this diner is a familiar escape, a place where time seems to slow down, where the world outside doesn't feel so cold. The air, however, is starting to feel different. There's a quiet tension that's beginning to settle. It's not just the usual diner hum. Something beneath the surface feels off. While the regular patrons continue with their meals, there's a certain unease that hangs in the air, though no one dares to voice it. The older man in the corner booth, Mr. Johnson, remains the calm center of this storm, though he's completely unaware of the shift that's slowly taking shape. The waitress, as she moves about the diner, seems oblivious to the discomfort she's causing. Her movements are sharp, almost aggressive, as she goes about her duties. She has little patience for those she deems beneath her. Older customers in particular seem to rub her the wrong way. Mr. Johnson, with his slow, methodical manner, seems to fall into this category. His age, his quiet dignity, everything about him seems to irritate her, though it's unclear why. Perhaps it's his calm nature that unsettles her, or perhaps it's because in her eyes, someone like him shouldn't be occupying the space he does. She's seen people like Mr. Johnson before. The elderly, the poor, those who have lived long lives of struggle but seem to exist in a world that has left them behind. She's young and quick to judge, seeing only the surface of people. She doesn't see the years of history in Mr. Johnson's eyes, the wisdom that his weathered skin holds. She doesn't understand the countless stories he carries with him, stories of struggle, of survival, of moments that shaped him into the man he is today. All she sees is an old man, perhaps too slow, perhaps too quiet, but certainly not worthy of her attention. Her attitude toward him is not new. Over the course of her shifts, the waitress has made a habit of treating the older, less influential customers with disdain. She doesn't try to hide it. The patrons, for the most part, endure it quietly, unwilling to speak up or challenge her behavior. They've seen it all before and learned to look the other way. But there's something unsettling about her approach to Mr. Johnson, a frustration that seems to grow with every moment. Mr. Johnson, on the other hand, remains unbothered. He is no stranger to being dismissed or overlooked. In his lifetime, he's endured more than most could imagine, weathering countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. He's been judged, misunderstood, and mistreated countless times, but none of it phases him. At this stage of his life, He's learned to let things go, to take everything with grace. His patience is a product of years spent navigating a world that hasn't always treated him kindly, and it shows in his calm demeanor. Even in the face of the waitress's disrespect, he doesn't react. He simply watches her, waiting, perhaps aware of the subtle tension building in the air, but not letting it affect him. In a way, his quiet presence is a form of resistance, a defiance against the prejudice that others may try to impose on him. Where the waitress reacts with impatience, he responds with stillness. Where she rushes through her tasks, he takes his time. His slow, deliberate movements, his soft-spoken words are a reminder that dignity isn't about speed or loudness. It's about how you carry yourself in the face of adversity. And while the waitress might see Mr. Johnson as just another old man, his life has taught him how to survive, how to endure, and how to stay grounded in the face of judgment. The contrast between the two is stark. A young, frustrated woman who feels the need to assert control, and an older, wiser man who has learned that control doesn't always lie in action. It sometimes resides in patience, in restraint. The power dynamics of this moment are subtle, but they're there. The waitress's frustration is palpable, but Mr. Johnson remains composed, unworried by her sharp words and quick movements. Little does she know, this moment is setting the stage for something that will challenge her assumptions about respect, age, and the value of those we often overlook. The diner, usually bustling with chatter and the clink of silverware, falls into an unnatural silence as the waitress approaches Mr. Johnson's table. Her posture is rigid, her face a mask of irritation. She places her hands on her hips and looks down at him with contempt, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Get up and leave," she commands sharply. "We don't have time for your kind." The words hang in the air, laden with weight, cutting through the veneer of civility that the diner pretends to uphold. The gesture she makes toward the other patrons is unmistakable, urging them to move on, to hurry, to ignore the growing tension. The message is clear. People like Mr. Johnson don't belong here. As the words leave her mouth, a subtle shift occurs. The diner's quiet hum seems to freeze, and the camera zooms in on Mr. Johnson's face. His brow twitches slightly, a faint flinch betraying the pain her words have caused. But there's no outburst, no angry retort. Mr. Johnson doesn't react the way the waitress likely expects him to. Instead, he sits still, his eyes meeting hers with quiet dignity, the faintest glimmer of sadness in his gaze. He's heard these kinds of words before, and despite the sting, they no longer have the power to break him. But this moment, this sharp insult in a public space, still leaves its mark. Around the diner, the atmosphere is thick with discomfort. The other patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances but offering no support. Some look at Mr. Johnson with pity, their eyes briefly meeting his before quickly averting to the table in front of them. It's as if they can't bear to witness the cruelty, yet they choose not to intervene. Others stare blankly ahead, pretending not to notice, hiding behind the veil of indifference. One diner, an older woman sitting by the window, catches Mr. Johnson's eye for a brief moment, her expression softening, but she quickly looks down at her plate, unwilling to acknowledge the injustice unfolding. A young man, probably in his late 20s, shifts in his chair, his gaze flickering toward Mr. Johnson, but quickly shifting away. There's a shared sense of discomfort in the room, a shared understanding of the weight of the moment, but no one speaks up. They are all too familiar with the dynamics at play, too accustomed to watching prejudice unfold in real time. The waitress, however, seems oblivious to the effect of her words. Her face is unreadable as she waits for Mr. Johnson to comply with her demand. She doesn't see the hurt she's inflicted. She doesn't see the lifetime of experiences, the history of struggles, the resilience of a man who has endured far worse than her words. To her, this is just another instance of dealing with someone she believes doesn't belong, someone whose presence is an inconvenience. But in that moment, the reality of the situation isn't lost on Mr. Johnson. His calm presence in the face of her insult becomes a quiet form of defiance. The world has spent years overlooking him, dismissing him because of his race, his age, and his background. And yet, here he sits, an elderly black man, unmoved by the weight of her words. His dignity, though silent, speaks volumes. The waitress's cruelty may have momentarily shaken him, but it doesn't define him. In his eyes, there's no need to explain himself, no need to justify his right to exist in this space. His existence is his own justification. He deserves respect not because of anything he has to prove, but simply because he is human. Despite this, the tension in the room is palpable. The air feels thick, suffocating, as the power dynamics play out in front of the disinterested eyes of the other patrons. They've all seen this dance before, one of power, of subtle cruelty, of indifference. They all know that when something like this happens, the best course of action is to stay quiet, stay safe, and let someone else deal with it. But for Mr. Johnson, it's not just about surviving the moment. It's about living with the integrity that he's cultivated over a lifetime. He is a man who knows what it means to fight, to resist, and to carry himself with dignity, no matter how the world chooses to see him. And as the waitress stands there, expecting him to back down, she doesn't realize that in refusing to let her words affect him, he's already won. For a few long seconds, the room holds its breath. The waitress waits, staring at Mr. Johnson, but he doesn't flinch. He doesn't budge. And just for a moment, as the room stands still, it feels like the power has shifted, quietly, imperceptibly. As the story unfolds, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it? The room remains tense as Mr. Johnson slowly rises from his booth. The scrape of his cane against the floor is the only sound that cuts through the thick silence. His movements are deliberate, measured. He doesn't hurry, doesn't rush to make a scene. Every step he takes is calm, grounded, as if the years of experience behind him have taught him how to handle any situation with grace and dignity. The waitress, still standing with her back to him, doesn't immediately notice that Mr. Johnson is getting up. She's still fuming from their exchange, expecting him to cower or leave. But when she hears the tap of the cane, she freezes, her posture shifting. She looks back toward him, eyes narrowing, unsure of what comes next. The air in the diner is thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that comes from a confrontation that's about to take a turn no one expected. Without a word, Mr. Johnson reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a business card, the kind of card that belongs to someone who's built something, someone who commands attention. He places it on the table, smooth and precise, with no drama or theatrics. The card sits there, resting in front of the waitress like a quiet challenge. The camera zooms in on the card as Mr. Johnson's fingers gently slide it toward her. There's no rush, no urgency, just calm. The words on the card are clear. Owner, Johnson Enterprises. The waitress's eyes scan the card slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. The name means nothing to her at first. It's only when the weight of what she's holding begins to sink in that the realization hits her, like a wave crashing over her. She blinks a few times, staring at the card. The initial shock makes her hesitate. Then her eyes flick up to Mr. Johnson, and in that moment, everything changes. She's no longer looking at an elderly black man sitting in a booth. She's looking at a man with power, with authority, and with a wealth of experience far beyond what her assumptions had led her to believe. The silence that follows is palpable. The waitress's mouth hangs open for a moment, unsure of what to say. Her face flushes slightly, realizing the full scope of her mistake. The entire room seems to hold its breath as Mr. Johnson stands tall before her, a dignified presence that contrasts sharply with the confrontation just moments earlier. "You're lucky I'm not calling in my associates," Mr. Johnson says, his voice steady, yet firm. It's not a threat. It's a quiet statement of fact. His words, though calm, carry an undeniable weight. They're not meant to escalate the situation. They're meant to underline the gravity of what's just happened. The waitress, still standing frozen in disbelief, doesn't know how to respond. Mr. Johnson doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His quiet, measured words have already carried the message. He's made his point. He's not just another customer, someone to be dismissed or ignored. He's not someone to be treated with disrespect. And now, for the first time, the waitress is forced to reckon with the fact that her assumptions were wrong. She has misjudged this man, this person who she thought was nothing more than a target for her impatience. The weight of that realization settles in, and she finds herself at a loss for words. The patrons around the diner who have been watching this unfold begin to stir. Their eyes shift from Mr. Johnson to the waitress, some unsure of what to do with the sudden shift in power dynamics. The regulars, who have witnessed her treatment of others before, now look on with a mix of curiosity and newfound respect for Mr. Johnson. The tension in the air shifts, and the room that was once filled with discomfort now feels a little different. The waitress, still holding the card, begins to stammer, her initial confidence faltering. Her gaze flickers back and forth between the business card and Mr. Johnson, trying to process what she's just learned. The realization that she has just insulted the owner of multiple businesses, including upscale restaurants, hits her hard. The arrogant, dismissive attitude that once defined her behavior crumbles in the face of the truth. But Mr. Johnson isn't here to make her feel small. He doesn't need to. His quiet confidence speaks volumes. He's lived through far more than this moment, a moment that, for him, is just another brush with ignorance in a lifetime filled with adversity. And yet, he stands there, not demanding anything from her, not expecting anything, but simply allowing her to come to her own understanding. In the end, the situation speaks for itself. Mr. Johnson doesn't need to shout or demand respect. The truth has already been revealed, and it's more powerful than any words could be. The waitress, in her embarrassment, begins to understand that the man she had dismissed is someone who deserves far more than she ever gave him. The atmosphere in the diner remains heavy with tension after the exchange between Mr. Johnson and the waitress. The regulars, once disinterested, now observe with quiet curiosity as the weight of the moment settles over the room. The silence lingers long after Mr. Johnson's calm departure, as the truth of what just occurred hangs in the air, leaving a shift that no one in the diner will soon forget. The waitress, now fully aware of her blunder, stands frozen at the counter, her face an ashen shade of red as the realization of her behavior sets in. She stammers out an apology, her words rushed. "I'm sorry, But her voice falters. Mr. Johnson, unmoved by her words, nods once, His silent acknowledgment is the only response she receives, and it speaks louder than any words could. There's no need for him to press her further, no need for him to berate her. Her actions, after all, have already been exposed for what they are, rooted in prejudice, entitlement, and an assumption of superiority. As Mr. Johnson begins to leave, the camera lingers on the waitress's face, still flushed with embarrassment. She watches him walk away, her eyes filled with regret, realizing too late that the man she had dismissed so easily was someone far more important than she could have ever known. There is a painful humility in her posture as she turns back to the counter, avoiding the eyes of the regulars who, now seeing her in a new light, look at her with mixed feelings, some disappointed, others perhaps with a touch of sympathy for the lesson she's just learned. But Mr. Johnson doesn't leave without one final remark. Before exiting the diner, he turns to the diner's owner, someone he's known for years, though the staff has never been aware of their relationship. Mr. Johnson, with a tone that is calm but unwavering, tells the owner, "This place is off my list now." The words are simple, but they carry a quiet authority. The owner, who has overheard the interaction and understood the underlying message, gives a small nod in acknowledgement. The impact of Mr. Johnson's statement is not lost on him. As Mr. Johnson exits the diner, the weight of the moment continues to hang in the air. The tension in the room slowly begins to dissipate, but the shift has already begun. Word of the confrontation spreads like wildfire throughout the town. In the days that follow, the incident becomes a topic of conversation among the townspeople. Some discuss it in hushed voices, others more openly. It sparks a deeper conversation about respect, assumptions, and the dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their background or status. The news of what happened in the diner spreads quickly, and with it comes a collective reflection on the way people are treated, based on preconceived notions. People begin to question their assumptions about others, especially those they have marginalized or overlooked. The town, once comfortable in its biases, is now forced to reckon with the fact that Mr. Johnson's silent power and dignity have exposed the flaws in their treatment of others. The waitress, having been forced to confront her own prejudices, will likely never forget the lesson she learned that day. The owner of the diner, too, feels the sting of what's happened, understanding that his establishment has become a place of discomfort for others because of his staff's treatment of people like Mr. Johnson. But it is the community as a whole that feels the shift the most. What was once an unspoken norm, a way of treating people who were different, who didn't fit the mold, is now questioned, challenged, and, for many, rejected outright. In the days after the confrontation, the town begins to have conversations about dignity and respect in a way they hadn't before. People talk more openly about how assumptions and biases affect their interactions, and they begin to take steps to correct the wrongs they've lived with. Malik's story has shown them all that one act of dignity can spark a ripple of change, challenging the status quo and forcing people to reconsider the way they treat others. As for Mr. Johnson, he doesn't look for accolades or recognition. He simply continues to live his life with the same dignity and grace that he has always embodied. He knows that sometimes a simple moment of standing up for what is right is enough to spark the change the world so desperately needs. His actions have proven that integrity, respect, and self-worth are more powerful than any prejudice. His legacy, one of quiet strength, will continue to resonate in the town long after his departure. The transformation that occurs in the diner is one that reverberates far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The waitress, now standing in the silence of the aftermath, is left to wrestle with the deep-seated biases she had allowed to guide her actions. In the face of Mr. Johnson's quiet dignity, she is forced to confront the harsh reality of her own prejudices. The apology she stammers out, though genuine, can't undo the hurt she has caused, but it marks the beginning of her own journey towards self-awareness. She has learned a hard lesson in humility, in humanity, and in the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, rather than making assumptions based on appearance or race. Mr. Johnson's actions, however, are not just a moment of personal victory. They act as a catalyst for broader change. His quiet strength and grace become a mirror for the rest of the diner's patrons and the community beyond. It's not just about his response to one moment of disrespect, but about the message he sends to those who witness it. By calmly standing his ground and demonstrating his own worth, Mr. Johnson forces the people around him to reflect on how they treat others, especially those who might not fit the mold of societal expectation. His presence in that diner becomes a powerful reminder that respect is not something that should be earned based on appearance or status, but something that should be given freely to all. The dignity he exhibits becomes a quiet protest against the biases and assumptions that so many have come to accept as truth. His actions speak volumes not only about his character, but about the way we should all strive to treat one another. In the days following the incident, the ripple effect of Mr. Johnson's quiet stand continues to unfold. The diner becomes a place where conversations are sparked, where the once muted tensions surrounding race and respect begin to rise to the surface. Regulars who had once turned a blind eye to the subtle prejudices that permeated their town begin to acknowledge them. Even the owner, who had stayed silent during the confrontation, starts to question how his establishment may have perpetuated these biases through unchecked behavior. The town begins to take small steps towards addressing these inequities as the community starts to come to terms with its own prejudices. The realization that these assumptions, these quiet injustices, had been allowed to fester for so long leads to a shift in perspective. What started as a simple act of standing up to disrespect becomes a spark for a larger movement, pushing the community to reconsider how they've treated people who are different from themselves. The waitress's apology, though a small first step, is only the beginning of a larger transformation. As she begins to reflect on her actions, the town begins to follow suit. People start questioning their behaviors, whether it's in the workplace, at the grocery store, or in their interactions with strangers on the street. They start to challenge their assumptions, and they become more aware of the biases that had influenced their decisions for far too long. It's not an easy process, and change doesn't happen overnight. But Malik's quiet strength, embodied by Mr. Johnson's graceful response to prejudice, continues to reverberate through the streets of the town long after the confrontation has ended. His dignity, his respect for others, and his refusal to be pushed aside have changed the community in ways that no one could have predicted. The camera zooms out from the diner, capturing a town that is slowly but surely coming to terms with the reality of its own biases. The once quiet whispers of racism and prejudice begin to fade, replaced by a more open dialogue. People look around and see each other not as stereotypes or judgments, but as individuals worthy of respect, regardless of their background or appearance. The town, forever altered by one man's refusal to accept disrespect, begins to heal and transform. As the camera fades to black, the narrator's voice cuts through the stillness. What would you have done in this situation? Have you ever had your assumptions challenged by someone unexpected? Share your thoughts below, And don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. This moment, captured in a small diner, becomes an example of the power of one person's actions to spark lasting change. Through one act of dignity, Mr. Johnson not only changed the way one person saw the world, but shifted the entire town's perspective. The power of humility, the power of truth, and the power of standing tall in the face of prejudice will stay with the community long after the last bite of food is eaten and the last table is cleared. It serves as a reminder that we are all capable of inspiring change, no matter our circumstances.